Good morning, God's beloved children of Trinity. I hope you and your family are well. It's hard to believe the summer's almost over. But time moves on with God's grace, and so will we. My heart broke Wednesday night when we changed channels from PBS and the Republican National Convention to CBS, expecting a weather forecast and Colbert. Instead, we saw live the looting happening in downtown Minneapolis. My heart broke because of the deeper reason behind the looting. Another unarmed black man, Jacob Blake, had been shot, which revealed again how little change has happened and how afraid our black brothers and sisters still are every time they leave their homes. And my heart broke because the wounds from George Floyd's death are still so raw. I've been hearing from a lot of places that we, our city, our nation, and the world, are at a crossroads. We're in the midst of a perfect storm of sorts. COVID is still not under control. Our country is so divided in the midst of an election that promises to get nastier. The racial injustices all around have only just begun to be addressed. And there has been, in fact, a perfect storm in Louisiana. I've also been hearing that this time things will change and that everything will be all right, even better than they were before. I'm either a realist or a cynic, but I'm not convinced that we will all come out of this experience having grown and learned and changed for the good. Both Jeremiah and Matthew may have something to say to us right now. This isn't the first time things have seemed so unsettled and unjust, and this won't be the last. Jeremiah wrote these words, commonly called Jeremiah's Laments or Confessions, in the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE, just before and after the destruction of Judah. When Jerusalem was destroyed, many of the people were deported to Babylonia. Jeremiah had tried before the destruction to warn the people what would happen because of their involvement in the sinful society. Some say God's judgment allowing the Babylonians to destroy the kingdom was because they were not worshiping the Lord only, that they had put their trust in earthly powers and things. Others say that the judgment came because the people had betrayed the Lord through their violence. The huge gap between God's call to justice and the reality that Jeremiah faced led Jeremiah to despair, which sounds an awful lot like where many of us find ourselves today. And we find ourselves at a crossroads. In so many ways, it seems like everything is at stake right now. At times like this, we're often encouraged to turn to the cross. But what does that even mean? Think back to that dark Friday when Jesus died on a cross. It's easy to forget that back then, before the cross became a sign of salvation, it was only seen as a violent tool of condemnation. It was a symbol of what happens when the powers in place are challenged. It was a tool and a symbol of what happens when someone goes against those powers and tries to change the world. Jesus' willingness to die on a cross was a willingness to be against such a power that oppressed and silences the oppressed. Jesus on a cross meant a willingness to speak up for those the world would much rather crucify than hear. Jesus on a cross meant having the courage to call a thing what it is. It meant the willingness to speak the truth and speak out against leaders and institutions who only put themselves first. It has been said that Jesus' death on the cross was somehow an attempt to show the disciples what kind of life they were getting into, as if a clever slogan, "Take up your cross," could explain or inspire a life centered in the cross? What if instead we think of the cross as marking a moment in time when everything changed, a time when the ways of life were no longer set, no longer to stay the way they had always been, a time when how to be in the world was no longer as clear as we thought it was, a time when God was changing the direction of the future. Instead of being something to believe in, what if the cross was a moment in time? Certainly a moment in the lives of the first disciples when they learned how they were to believe, but also a moment in time for the world. If the world is at a crossroads right now, so are we. It's hard to know what that means and what we should do. How many times have we asked ourselves and each other, what can we do? Maybe this is a cross kind of moment. Maybe this is a moment when we find out that the life we thought we wanted, prayed for, and planned for was not exactly the life God had in mind. What if this is a moment when we might have to choose whether or not we are willing to choose something else in life? In other words, what if this moment of perfect storms is a cross moment, a time that we are at the crossroads? What if this is a moment when everything is up in the air, including how we might be in the world as followers of Jesus? What if this is a cross moment when our identity as Christians is called into question or is at stake or maybe even in jeopardy? What if the cross is, at this time and place, a reminder not of who we are, but of who the world needs us to be? Jeremiah's struggle sounds very familiar, almost as if then is now. Those with power did their best to silence those who were working for a more just world, those who were working towards God's desires for the world, speaking out on behalf of the poor, the homeless, the displaced. At the time, God's vision of a just society seemed impossible because of the ignorance and opposition all around. Even as Jeremiah stood exhausted, God was convinced the work must still happen. For Jeremiah, it was a kind of cross moment. In his despair, God tells him that he has to continue to preach the word to the people, the word of peace and justice, the word of putting trust in God rather than things and other people. The powerful tried to keep silencing Jeremiah, but God remained steadfast. The disciples were not just witnesses to Jesus' suffering and death. They were, in their hearts and souls, in their very being, participants. Even though they weren't all at the foot of the cross, they too were changed forever by that moment in time that changed everything for them, for their lives. It was a moment for rethinking all that they had thought they had known. Friends, we are at a cross moment. We are at a time for us to stop and look and ask what the world needs us to be and do. Again, can this be a moment when we will grow and learn and make changes for the better? Changes like those that were needed to keep Jeremiah's warnings to the people of Judah from ending up fulfilled? Perhaps we are. I don't buy what some would have us believe, that this is the most challenging time our world has faced, that there's never been anything like it. There have been more than enough seemingly impossible moments through the centuries. Through all of them, there has been hope. And there's a strong word of hope that sometimes is missed in today's gospel. We get so wrapped up in the bad news that we miss the good news. Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering, and on the third day be raised. As the disciples contemplated all of the bad things that were to come, they missed this. They missed the good news. It was just too far beyond anything they could imagine. These words of hope are for us as well. These days, let us do our best to be open to the good news, that hope and promise that are right before us. These words from Jesus are not just a request that we be ready to suffer. They are a word of hope. They are a word of hope that because of a cross some 2,000 years ago, there is a new life before us, always. There's a hope that we will take this moment and allow ourselves to be changed. There is no doubt that so much seems to be up for grabs. Why not be open and let that possibility of hope get into us, really get into us, and then act with unprecedented boldness in these unusual times? Because the only thing on the other side is life. Amen.